There's a story from the golden age of martial arts cinema that few people know, a moment that happened behind closed doors, away from cameras and crowds. It involves two legends, Bruce Lee, the revolutionary force who brought martial arts to the Western world, and Chucknorris, the quiet champion who earned his respect through humility and iron discipline. But this isn't about their famous fight scene in The Way of the Dragon. This is about what happened months later, when Bruce's relentless drive and intensity crossed a line he didn't even know existed. It was a moment that would teach the unteachable teacher a lesson about pushing people too far, about mistaking patience for weakness, and about the difference between power and control. Chucknorris was a man who could take almost anything, a fighter who had weathered storms that would have broken lesser men. But every man has a limit, even the ones who seem unshakable. And when Bruce finally pushed Chuck past that invisible boundary, the lesson that followed was swift, surgical, and unforgettable. This is the story of what happened when the dragon finally woke the sleeping wolf. The California sun hung heavy over the training facility in Torrance, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. Chucknorris arrived early, as he always did, carrying his worn gym bag and the weight of 1,000 responsibilities on his shoulders. His karate schools were thriving, his competition days were behind him, but the discipline that had carried him through 6 world championships still dictated every aspect of his life. He moved through the empty space with the quiet confidence of a man who had nothing left to prove, setting up the heavy bag, laying out his hand wraps, preparing for another day of honest work. He wasn't expecting visitors. He certainly wasn't expecting Bruce Lee. The door opened with a force that seemed to pull all the air from the room. Bruce entered like a storm given human form, his energy crackling with that familiar intensity that had made him both beloved and feared in martial arts circles. Behind him came 3 of his students, young men with hungry eyes and something to prove, disciples of the dragon eager to demonstrate what they'd learned. Chuck looked up from his bag, offering a genuine smile, the kind that came from real friendship forged through mutual respect and shared passion. "Bruce," Chuck said, his voice carrying that Oklahoma drawl that never quite left him, no matter how many years he spent in California. "Good to see you, brother. Didn't know you were stopping by." Bruce didn't return the smile. His eyes held that laser-focused Chuck had seen before, the look he got when he was teaching, when he was pushing, when he was trying to break through someone's limitations, whether they wanted to be pushed or not. "We need to train," Bruce said, the words clipped and urgent. "Real training, not the sport karate softness." Chuck felt something tighten in his chest, a warning sign he'd learned to recognize over years of competition and countless confrontations. But this was Bruce, his friend, the man whose intensity came from passion, not malice. "Sure," Chuck said evenly. "Just let me finish setting up. Give me 10 minutes. "No time," Bruce cut him off. "We start now. Your students, they're too soft. I've seen them. All this point fighting. All these rules. It's making them weak. They need to understand real combat." The other instructors in the facility had started to arrive, sensing the shift in atmosphere the way animals sense approaching storms. They gathered at the edges of the room, uncertain whether to intervene or simply witness what was unfolding. Chuck's own students, young men and women who had come to trust his measured approach and patient teaching, looked to him for guidance, confusion written across their faces. Chuck took a slow breath, the kind he'd learned through meditation and hard experience. "Bruce, we talk about this. Different approaches, different philosophies. Doesn't mean either one is wrong." But Bruce was already moving, circling one of Chuck's senior students, a 22-year-old named David who had been training for 5 years and carried himself with the cautious confidence of someone still finding their way. "Show me your stance," Bruce demanded. David complied, dropping into the traditional karate stance Chuck had taught him, balanced and grounded. Bruce moved faster than thought, sweeping David's leg and sending him crashing to mat. "See? Too rigid, too predictable. In a real fight, you're already dead." David scrambled to his feet, his face flushed with embarrassment and anger. Chuck stepped forward, his voice still calm, but carrying an edge now. "Bruce, that's enough. You want to demonstrate something, you demonstrate on me. You don't come into my school and humiliate my students." For a moment, something flickered across Bruce's face. maybe recognition, maybe regret. But then the intensity returned, doubling down, fueled by that relentless need to prove, to push, to break through every barrier. "You're protecting them from the truth," Bruce said. "You're keeping them weak because you're afraid to push them the way they need to be pushed." The words landed like physical blows. Chuck had heard criticism before, had weathered every kind of attack and insult during his competition years. But this was different. This wasn't about him. This was about his students, his school, the life he'd built through patient dedication and honest teaching. Bruce was questioning not just his methods, but his integrity, his care for the people who trusted him. "We're done here," Chuck said quietly. "You need to leave." Bruce's eyes narrowed. "You're running?" The great Chucknorris, 6-time world champion, running from a little honest training. "I'm asking you to respect my space and my students," Chuck replied, his voice still controlled, but something hardening beneath the surface. "You've got your way, I've got mine. You want to train, we can set something up properly, with respect, but not like this." What happened next would be debated for years among those who witnessed it. Bruce stepped closer, his voice dropping to that dangerous quiet that preceded his most devastating techniques. "You're soft, Chuck. All this nice guy act, all this patience, it's made you soft. You've forgotten what it means to be a warrior." Chuck had been a soldier. He'd served in the Air Force, stationed in Korea when the wounds of that war were still fresh. He'd walked through villages where violence had left scars that would take generations to heal. He'd seen real warriors, men who carried death in their eyes and silence in their souls. He'd fought in tournaments where careers ended with a single mistake, where ego and ambition turned friends into enemies. He'd built his schools not because he'd forgotten what it meant to be a warrior, but because he understood it too well, understood that real strength came from knowing when to fight and when to show restraint. The memories flashed through his mind in an instant. His father's drunken rages, the violence that had shadowed his childhood in Oklahoma, the bullies he'd faced as a shy, awkward teenager before martial arts gave him not just strength, but purpose. The moment he'd first walked into a dojo and discovered that discipline could transform fear into confidence. His brother Wieland, killed in Vietnam, a warrior who'd given everything and received a folded flag in return. Every lesson Chuck had learned about violence and its consequences, about power and its proper use, about the difference between being a fighter and being a man. "Get out," Chuck said, and this time the words carried weight that made even Bruce pause. "Now." But Bruce wasn't finished. In his mind, he was teaching, pushing, doing what teachers do when students resist necessary lessons. He moved toward another of Chuck's students, a young woman named Sarah who had come to martial arts after a violent assault, seeking not aggression but agency, not dominance but dignity. Bruce raised his hand as if to demonstrate a technique, and something in Chuck simply decided. His hand shot out, not a strike, but a grip, iron fingers closing around Bruce's wrist with the kind of pressure that came from years of Makiwara training and genuine physical strength. Bruce tried to pull away, tried to employ one of his famous trapping techniques, but Chuck's grip was immovable, a vice that had been tempered through thousands of hours of honest work. "I said we're done," Chuck repeated, and now his voice carried something that Bruce had never heard from him before, a depth of resolve that transcended technique or speed or even skill. It was the sound of a line being drawn, a boundary being set, a man who had been pushed exactly one step too far. Bruce looked into Chuck's eyes and saw something that made him finally stop, finally pause, finally recognize that he'd miscalculated badly. He'd mistaken patience for weakness, mistaken kindness for softness, mistaken quiet strength for absence of strength. In Chuck's eyes, Bruce saw not anger but disappointment, not rage but sadness, and somehow that was worse than any physical confrontation could have been. The room had gone silent, everyone frozen, witnessing a moment that would become legend even though most would never speak of it publicly. Chuck released Bruce's wrist, the gesture deliberate and controlled, making it clear that he'd chosen to let go rather than being forced to. "You're my friend," Chuck said quietly. "You're a genius, a revolutionary, someone I respect more than almost anyone in this world. But you don't get to come into my school and treat people like they're your property, like they're raw materials for your vision. These students are people, Bruce. They have their own paths, their own reasons for being here. And you don't get to violate that, not even in the name of teaching. Bruce stood there, his legendary speed and power suddenly useless, his brilliant mind finally catching up to what his intensity had created. He looked around the room, seeing for the first time the faces of Chuck's students, the fear and hurt his actions had caused, the damage his good intentions had produced. He saw his own students watching, learning a lesson he hadn't intended to teach about the difference between confidence and arrogance, between pushing people and respecting them. For several long heartbeats, nobody moved. The California sunlight continued streaming to the windows, indifferent to the drama unfolding beneath it. The heavy bag swayed slightly from some earlier impact, its chain creaking in the silence. Somewhere outside, traffic hummed along the Pacific Coast Highway, the world continuing its rotation, oblivious of the moment of reckoning happening in the small training facility. Bruce's shoulders sagged, just slightly, a barely perceptible shift that somehow contained an entire mountain of realization. His eyes, always so intense and focused, softened with something that might have been shame, or might have been understanding, or maybe both. He opened his mouth to speak, closed it, then finally managed, "I pushed too hard." It was an apology, not quite, but coming from Bruce Lee, it was an acknowledgement that carried weight. Chuck nodded slowly, his grip on his own emotions still tight, still controlled, but gradually loosening as the immediate threat passed. "Yeah," he said simply, "you did. I just wanted them to understand," Bruce continued, and now his voice carried a vulnerability that few people ever heard from the dragon. "I wanted them to be ready, to be strong, to not get hurt because someone taught them techniques that won't work when it really matters." "I know," Chuck replied, and the understanding in his voice was genuine. "But you can't force understanding, Bruce. You can't beat wisdom into people. I learned it the hard way, teaching soldiers, teaching cops, teaching kids who came from the same kind of broken homes I came from. You meet people where they are, and you guide them forward. You don't drag them." Bruce looked at his own students, then back at Chuck. "When did you learn that?" Chuck's laugh was short and bitter. "After I failed at it about 1,000 times. After I pushed people away, try and make them better. After I realized that the strongest technique in martial arts isn't a kick or a punch. It's patience. It's seeing people clearly and loving them anyway." The words hung in the air, simple and profound, carrying more power than any physical technique either man had ever developed. Bruce's students shifted uncomfortably, perhaps recognizing something in those words that reflected their own teacher's approach, perhaps starting to see the limitations of pure intensity without balance. Sarah, the young woman Bruce had approached, found her voice. "Mr. Norris," she said quietly. "It's okay. I know Mr. Lee meant well." Chuck turned to her, his expression soft. "That's generous of you, Sarah. But meaning well doesn't erase impact. Someone can have the best intentions in the world and still hurt people. That's a lesson I had to learn too, and it's one I keep learning." He looked back at Bruce. "We all do." Bruce nodded slowly, processing this in that rapid-fire way his mind worked, integrating new information, and adjusting his understanding. "I came here to teach," he said. "I became the lesson instead." "That's how it works sometimes," Chuck agreed. "The best teachers are the ones who stay students." The tension in the room began to dissolve, not disappearing entirely, but transforming into something different, something more breathable. Chuck's students gradually resumed their positions, uncertain but trusting their instructor to navigate whatever came next. Bruce's students gathered closer to their teacher, perhaps seeing him as more human, more fallible, more real than the mythical figure they'd put on a pedestal. Bruce took a step toward the door, then paused. "Chuck, I need to think about this, about what you said." He turned back, meeting Chuck's eyes directly. "But you're right, about all of it. I got so caught up in what I thought people needed that I forgot to ask them what they wanted. I forgot that my way isn't the only way. Your way is brilliant." Chuck said firmly, "Your way is revolutionary. But brilliance can become tyranny if it doesn't leave room for other people's paths. You taught me that once, remember? When we were filming in Rome, and you told me that my karate had to stay pure, that I couldn't just adopt your style wholesale. You said every man has to find his own expression of truth. Bruce's eyes widened slightly with recognition. I did say that, didn't I? You did, and you were right. So maybe it's time you listened to your own wisdom. They stood there for a moment, these two legends, these two very different men who had somehow found friendship in the complicated world of martial arts and ego and Hollywood ambition. The moment stretched, holding possibility, offering a chance for something to shift permanently rather than just temporarily. Finally, Bruce bowed, a deep and genuine bow that carried respect and acknowledgement. Chuck returned it, matching the depth and sincerity. When they straightened, something had changed between them, some invisible recalibration of their relationship that would affect everything that followed. "I'll call you," Bruce said. "We'll talk, really talk, not just spar with words." "I'd like that," Chuck replied. Bruce gestured to his students, and they moved toward the door, the young men subdued and thoughtful, processing what they'd witnessed. As Bruce reached the threshold, he looked back one more time. "Thank you," he said simply, and then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a soft click that somehow felt final. The training facility erupted in nervous chatter as soon as Bruce left, students and instructors processing what they just witnessed, the near violence that had been averted, the confrontation that had somehow transformed into something else entirely. Chuck raised his hand for silence, and the room gradually quieted, all eyes turning to him. "What you saw today," Chuck began, his voice carrying that Oklahoma steadiness that made people feel safe, "was something that happens to everyone eventually. Someone you respect, someone you admire, crosses a line, and you have to decide whether to let it slide because of who they are, or to stand your ground because of who you are." David, the student Bruce had swept, spoke up, "But he's Bruce Lee. He's like the greatest martial artist who ever lived." "Maybe," Chuck agreed. "Probably. But being great at martial arts doesn't mean you're great at everything. Doesn't mean you get to treat people however you want. Bruce is human, just like all of us. He makes mistakes, just like all of us. The difference is what you do after the mistake. And today, Bruce did the right thing. He listened. He acknowledged. He left. That took more strength than any technique he could have demonstrated." Sarah raised her hand tentatively. "Mr. Norris, were you really going to fight him? If he hadn't stopped?" Chuck considered the question carefully, understanding its weight, knowing that his answer would shape how these students thought about conflict and resolution for years to come. "I was ready to defend myself and all of you if necessary," he said honestly. But fighting Bruce Lee wasn't the goal. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about drawing a line and holding it. Sometimes that's all you can do. You can't control other people's actions, but you can control how much you'll tolerate, where your boundaries are, what you'll accept and what you won't. He walked to the center of the mat, his movements deliberate and grounded, embodying the principles he was trying to communicate. "I want you all to remember something. Bruce came in here with good intentions. He genuinely believes his way is better, and maybe for him, it is. Maybe for some people, it is. But that doesn't give anyone the right to force their way on others. Not through intimidation, not through demonstrations of skill, not through making people feel small or weak or inadequate." The room was absolutely silent now, every person absorbing his words with complete attention. Chuck continued, "Real strength isn't about dominating people. It's not about proving you're the best or the fastest or the most dangerous. Real strength is about knowing your power and choosing not to use it except when absolutely necessary. It's about protecting people who can't protect themselves. It's about creating space where people can grow without fear." He paused, letting the words sink in, watching his understanding dawn on faces around the room. Bruce is strong, incredibly strong. But today he learned something that will make him even stronger if he really hears it. He learned that pushing people past their limits without their consent isn't teaching. It's assault. And that wisdom has limits, that there are things you can't force people to understand on your timeline. One of the senior instructors, a man named Michael who had trained with Chuck for over a decade, spoke up. "What happens now? Between you and Bruce?" Chuck smiled, and this time it reached his eyes, warming the serious atmosphere with genuine hope. "Now we see if the lesson sticks. Bruce is brilliant. but he's also driven in ways that could be destructive. He needs to decide if he's willing to moderate that drive with respect for other people's autonomy. If he is, then our friendship gets stronger. If he's not, then we'll have to go our separate ways. Either outcome is okay. Not every relationship is meant to last forever, and that's not a failure. It's just reality. The training session resumed, but it carried a different quality now, a deeper purpose. Students moved with more awareness, more intention, as if the confrontation they'd witnessed had awakened something in them, a recognition that martial arts was about more than techniques and trophies. It was about character, about choices, about how you treated people when you had power over them. Chuck worked with each student individually that day, offering corrections with patience and encouragement, demonstrating techniques with care and precision, creating exactly the kind of space he described. He caught himself several times almost mentioning Bruce, almost using the morning's events as a cautionary tale. But he stopped himself. The lesson was already learned. There was no need to belabor it, no need to turn Bruce into a villain in a story where there were no villains. Only people trying their best and sometimes failing. As the sun began its descent toward the Pacific, casting golden light through the western windows, Chuck dismissed his students and sat alone on the mat, processing everything that had happened. His body ached from the day's training, but his mind ached more from the emotional weight of the confrontation. Bruce was his friend. Seeing him so clearly in the wrong, so driven by good intentions that had curdled into something harmful, had hurt in ways that physical pain never could. But he'd done the right thing. He knew that with certainty. Not the easy thing, not the thing that preserved harmony at the cost of principle, but the right thing, the thing that protected vulnerable people and established necessary boundaries and demonstrated that even legends could be held accountable for their actions. The phone in the office rang, cutting through his meditation. Chuck stood, his joints protesting slightly, and walked to answer it. Norris, karate, he said, expecting a student or a parent or maybe a bill collector. Chuck. Bruce's voice came through the line, quiet and thoughtful. I've been thinking all day about what happened. Yeah, Chuck replied, settling into the desk chair. Me too. I called to say I'm sorry. Really sorry, not just performatively. I violated your space, disrespected your students, questioned your integrity. That was wrong, regardless of my intentions. Chuck felt something release in his chest, a tension he hadn't fully acknowledged he'd been carrying. I appreciate that, Bruce. Genuinely. I want to understand, Bruce continued, why you teach the way you do. Not to judge it or fix it or convert you to my approach. Just understand it. Because clearly there's something I'm missing, something important. I teach the way I do, Chuck said slowly, choosing his words with care, because I remember what it felt like to be afraid, to feel small and powerless and like the world was full of threats I couldn't handle. Martial arts gave me confidence, but not because someone beat it into me. Because someone patient and kind showed me that I had strength I didn't know about, that I was capable of more than I believed. Bruce was silent for a long moment, processing this. I never felt small, he said finally. Even as a kid, I was always confident, always sure of myself. Maybe too sure. So I don't understand that fear you're talking about. Not from the inside. That's why we teach differently, Chuck replied. You're trying to make people as strong as you are, as fearless as you are. I'm trying to help people discover they're already stronger than they think. Same goal, maybe, but different paths to get there. Different students need different teachers, Bruce mused. I've said that before, but I don't think I really believed it until today. I thought if everyone just trained harder, pushed harder, demanded more from themselves, everyone could reach that same level. But that's not true, is it? Some people need safety before they need challenge. Some people need permission before they need pressure. And some people need pressure, Chuck added. Your students, the ones who come to you, they probably thrive on that intensity. They need someone to push them past what they think is possible. That's valuable too. It's just not the only way. Another long pause, filled with the crackle of the phone line and the weight of genuine reconciliation. Can we train together sometime? Bruce asked, not competing, not proving anything, just sharing. I want to learn your patience. God knows I need it. Chuck laughed, the sound genuine and warm. "And I could use some of your intensity. Sometimes I'm too patient, too willing to let things slide. Balance, right?" "Balance," Bruce agreed. "The thing I'm always talking about and rarely achieving." They talked for another hour, comparing philosophies and approaches, sharing stories about students who'd succeeded and students who'd failed, finding common ground in their commitment to martial arts even as they acknowledged their different expressions of that commitment. By the time they hung up, something had been repaired, but also something had been established. A new understanding, a clearer boundary, a friendship that was stronger for having been tested and survived. The weeks that followed brought subtle changes to both men's teaching. Bruce began asking his students more questions, checking in on their emotional state, recognizing that intensity without compassion could break people rather than make them stronger. Chuck pushed his students a bit harder, challenged them more directly, realizing that too much safety could become a cage that prevented genuine growth. They met occasionally for private training sessions, sharing techniques and philosophies, learning from each other in ways that enriched both their approaches. Bruce would demonstrate his famous one-inch punch, and Chuck would break down the weight transfer and hip rotation that made it work, seeing in Bruce's technique elements that could enhance his own power generation. Chuck would show his precision kicking techniques, developed through thousands of repetitions and tournament experience, and Bruce would find new angles and applications that fit his more fluid approach. Their students noticed the changes, the way each teacher seemed more complete, more rounded, more able to meet different people's needs. Word spread to the martial arts community about what had happened that day in Torrance, though the details got muddied and exaggerated through retelling. Some versions had them actually fighting. Some had Bruce storming out in rage. Some had Chuck delivering some perfect whys, saying that instantly transformed Bruce's understanding. The truth, as always, was more complicated and more human. Two men, both skilled and both flawed, had collided over differences in philosophy and approach. One had crossed a line. The other had held a boundary. Both had learned something essential about respect and teaching, and the responsibility that came with power and skill and influence. The story that had started with tension and confrontation ended with growth and understanding. Not perfectly, not easily, but honestly, which mattered more. Years later, after Bruce's death shocked the world and left Chuck grieving for his friend and everything they'd never get to share, Chuck would reflect on that day in Torrance as one of the most important moments in their friendship, not because of the confrontation itself, but because of what it had revealed about both of them. Bruce's willingness to push boundaries and sometimes break them in pursuit of excellence. Chuck's ability to hold boundaries and enforce them when necessary, both qualities essential, both dangerous in isolation, both strengthened through balance and mutual respect. He would tell his students about it sometimes, when they asked about Bruce, when they wanted to know what the legendary dragon was really like. Chuck would smile sadly and say, he was brilliant and difficult and kind and harsh, sometimes all at once. He wanted to make everyone as great as he was, which was both inspiring and exhausting. But when he was wrong, when he pushed too far, he could admit it. He could learn. That's what made him not just a great martial artist, but a great man. He was still growing, still evolving right up until the end. The real lesson wasn't about techniques or training methods, or even about the specifics of what happened that morning in California. The real lesson was about human dignity, about respecting people's autonomy, about the difference between teaching and dominating. It was about understanding that strength without wisdom is just violence, and wisdom without strength is just philosophy. You needed both. You needed the ability to fight and the judgment to know when fighting was necessary and when it would just cause harm. Bruce Lee was a revolutionary who changed martial arts forever, who brought Eastern wisdom to Western audiences, who demonstrated that a small man could be devastatingly powerful through proper technique and conditioning. His legacy is immense and deserved. But he was also human, capable of mistakes, capable of letting his intensity override his judgment, capable of pushing people too hard in his eagerness to help them improve. Chucknorris was a champion who proved that American fighters could compete with the best in the world, who built schools and programs that helped thousands of people find confidence and strength. His legacy is quieter but no less significant. He was also human, capable of doubt, capable of patience that sometimes bordered on passivity, capable of letting his desire to be liked. Sometimes compromises need to be respected. Both men were legends. Both men were flawed. The day they clashed in that training facility in Torrance, both men became better versions of themselves through the conflict and its resolution. That's the real story. Not a tale of dominance or victory, but a tale of growth and understanding, and the courage to hold boundaries even when it costs you something you value. Real strength isn't about never being challenged. It's not about always being right, or always winning, or always maintaining control. Real strength is about knowing yourself well enough to recognize when someone crosses your line, regardless of who they are or what they've accomplished. It's about standing up for yourself and for the people who depend on you, even when it's difficult, even when it would be easier to let things slide. Real teaching isn't about dominating students or forcing them into your vision of who they should be. It's about meeting people where they are and guiding them forward with a combination of challenge and support, pressure and safety, intensity and patience. Different students need different approaches, and great teachers learn to modulate their style to fit the person in front of them rather than expecting everyone to adapt to a single method. Real friendship isn't about never disagreeing or never having conflict. It's about being able to tell the truth even when it's uncomfortable, to hold each other accountable even when it's difficult, to say, "You pushed too far," and have that be heard and respected rather than dismissed or punished. These are the lessons that echoed through the years following that confrontation. Not lessons about kicks or punches or fighting techniques, but lessons about being human, about balancing strength with compassion, about using power responsibly. In the end, the story of that day isn't really about Bruce Lee or Chuck Norris specifically. It's about all of us, about every time we have to decide whether to cross someone's boundary or respect it, whether to push our agenda or honor someone else's autonomy, whether to dominate or to collaborate. It's about recognizing that even the best intentions can cause harm if they're not balanced with respect and genuine listening. Bruce Lee taught Chuck Norris many things over their friendship. He taught him about speed and fluidity and the importance of constant evolution. But that day in Torrance, Chuck taught Bruce something equally valuable. He taught him that patience isn't weakness, that kindness isn't softness, that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is simply refuse to be pushed further than you're willing to go. And Bruce, to his eternal credit, learned the lesson. He heard what Chuck was really saying beneath the confrontation and the tension. He recognized his mistake and adjusted his approach. That willingness to grow, to admit error, to evolve even when it meant acknowledging he'd been wrong. That's what separated him from countless other skilled martial artists who let their ego trap them in patterns that never changed. The dragon and the wolf. The revolutionary and the champion. Two different expressions of martial excellence, learning from each other, teaching each other, making each other better through both harmony and conflict. Their story reminds us that greatness isn't about perfection. It's about the courage to keep growing, keep learning, keep adjusting even when you think you've already reached the top of the mountain. Because there is no top of the mountain. There's just a journey, the constant process of becoming better than you were yesterday, of learning from your mistakes, of respecting the people around you even as you push yourself and them toward excellence. That's the real martial art, not the techniques we practice on the mat, but the wisdom we develop through years of sincere effort and honest self-examination. Chuck Norris pushed back that day not because he wanted to prove he was stronger than Bruce Lee, but because he understood something essential about human dignity and respect. And Bruce Lee listened not because he was weak, but because he was wise enough to recognize truth even when it was uncomfortable, even when it contradicted his assumptions, even when it meant admitting he'd been wrong. That's the story. That's the lesson. Not about fighting, but about growing. Not about dominance, but about respect. Not about being right, but about being willing to learn. And in the end, that made both men not just better martial artists, but better human beings. The quiet power of those who have nothing left to prove. The strength to hold a boundary even against a legend. The wisdom to admit when you've crossed a line. The courage to forgive without forgetting. The ability to turn conflict into growth rather than grudge. These are the real martial arts. The ones that matter long after our bodies can no longer kick and punch. The ones that define not just how we fight, but how we live.